Welcome to the What's Your Grief podcast. I'm Eleanor Haley.
And I'm Lisa Williams. We're the mental health professionals turned grief friends turned co-founders of the website What's Your Grief.
In this podcast, we talk candidly about all things grief, from pop culture to grief theory.
No tilted heads, no soothing tones, just us and our grief friends exploring the always devastating,
Often confusing,
and sometimes even funny experience of living life after loss.
Hey, this is Eleanor.
And this is Lisa.
Welcome back to another episode of the What's Your Grief podcast. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Lisa, how's it going?
Oh, it's going okay. It's going okay. Not great, not terrible, which
Right.
at the moment I'm satisfied with. How about you?
It's the same, pretty much the same, which is a problem we have been discussing here, Lisa and I. It is currently May 19th, and like many of you, we are in the middle of various stages of social distancing and lack of many of the things that we used to do, lack of structure, and so on. And so there's not a lot for us to banter about here at the beginning of our podcast, which you may see as a blessing. But for us, it feels odd to just jump right into a big topic. So we've been talking about what we can do at the beginning of our podcast for now to get warmed up. And we were thinking that we could answer some icebreaker questions, some sort of easy, quick questions with quick and easy answers. And we actually are asking all of our listeners, if you have a fun icebreaker question or just a question that could be answered quick and easily, maybe even like some sort of pop culture recommendation and asking us what we thought about it, something that will generate a little bit of conversation, but not something too deep. We ask you to email us at podcast@whatsyourgrief.com with your intro icebreaker questions. And of course, you can always use that email address to email us about any sort of topic requests or even more complex questions, which we will try and answer in some sort of way, shape, or form on the podcast or elsewhere. So with that, we don't have any questions from you all, obviously, because we're just putting the call out today, but we still want to get the ball rolling with some sort of intro question. And so, Lisa, what are we going to be doing?
So today I have pulled out my box of questions from the We're Not Really Strangers game, which I don't know if people are familiar with, but it's a great little get to know other people game that's done by this artist out in LA who creates public art with lots of thought-provoking, self-reflective questions and statements. So they're sort of all over the map. So I've pulled out a few to randomly choose a question that we will then answer as our icebreaker. So
okay, pick an easy one.
Sound okay? Pick an easy one. Well, I was going to randomly.
Okay, well, randomly pick an easy one.
All right, I'm going to randomly pick an easy one. I mean, some of these are okay. All right, it's okay. Just going to pick. All right.
All right.
All right. Oh, I wish I had like a sound effect of cards right now. Okay, got it. Okay. This question is a little bit complicated, but I have one that popped right into my mind as soon as I read it. So hopefully not too bad. I can go first if you need a minute. What is the lesson that took you the longest to unlearn? I mean, longest is like dramatic, but I'm just thinking like, what's a lesson that took a long time to unlearn?
Okay. I can come up with a grief-related answer, I think.
Oh, all right. Okay, that's good. I mean, mine is one that I've rationally unlearned, but I haven't maybe emotionally unlearned, and that is that it's not my job to make other people happy all the time. I think that is a lesson. Like I was instilled, like many people, and maybe I'll also say women, are that feeling of like, I have to make sure people are okay. I do that thing when people like come into a room of wanting to like make sure they're situated and that everything is like set and taken care of. And it's taken me a long time to remember like, that's not my responsibility. It's not my job. I don't need to like constantly be doing that. So
Yeah.
it has totally, I can't say I've like mastered not feeling it emotionally, but
Oh yeah, I think that's a really hard one to get rid of. It's one that I think you like live with in many ways, and you just have to constantly remind yourself of if you're in the habit of being that way. I feel similar. Not that I'm always trying to make everybody happy necessarily, but that I always assume it's like my fault when someone's not happy. So which I've learned over the years that quite often when people are unhappy or even in some sort of conflict with me, that quite often, not always, obviously I do things wrong all the time and create problems in my life, but quite often it's not me, it's them, and I always assume it's me. So I've had to unlearn that, which I think is kind of similar to what you were saying.
yeah, it's like they're hard lessons, and I think like we get those, they become those like automatic thoughts, and they're in us from very early. So I think it becomes
Right.
really hard to shake them over time.
Absolutely. So mine, I know this is like, these are the type of questions that you think about and then you probably come up with like better answers when you're in the shower later or something. But I think for me, one that I was just recently talking about, and so I guess that's probably why it popped into my mind, is that things are not one way. They're not one thing or the other. It's not black and white. People are not good or bad. Emotions are not good or bad. We can feel far more than one thing at a time, even if emotions seemingly contradict each other. Because I feel like even though I would have intellectually been able to say that to you a long time ago, I didn't really fully understand just how flexible it benefits us to be in thinking about our experiences and about the people in our lives. Because, as people who are grieving, we know that many experiences can be happy and sad all at the same time. We can be mad at our loved one and also miss our loved one like crazy at the same time. And we can feel a sense of strength and growth from our experiences, and also, a sense of great vulnerability. And so I think for me, this is something that it's taken me a long time to really fully absorb and understand.
Yeah, I think that that's one that many people struggle with. I think part of the reason that we talk about that a fair amount on What's Your Grief is because it's one that's really hard. It like goes against the way our brains
Right.
sort of naturally operate, I think, where our brains like to put things into categories. And I think that's because that's how we live in this really complicated world. And it's one of the ways that our brain makes the world a little bit easier to digest for us is by putting things into categories. But that in a lot of moments that really doesn't serve us, because we think things are either or we think if it's one thing, it can't also be another thing, when that isn't actually true. So
Exactly.
yeah, I very much hear you on that one. Huh. Good question. I liked that question.
Yeah, and though it wasn't grief related necessarily, I think both of our answers are kind of relevant to our experiences in grief and interpersonal relationships and life after loss and things like that. So yes, again, please send us your questions to podcast@whatsyourgrief.com. So with that, I think we're going to talk about our main topic for the day, which is something that I find to be particularly relevant right now, because as I said before, we currently are still doing the social distancing thing, and many of our structures and the things that we did in our day-to-day lives we're not connected with. And so I think it's particularly useful right now, but it's also, I think, very relevant to grief. Wouldn't you say, Lisa?
Absolutely. I think it's very, very relevant to both. And there have been many ways that we've been talking about how the current COVID situation and things going on mirror certain things in grief. And so I think this is just kind of yet another example where we can see how it comes up in both areas and how those might interplay with each other too.
Right. And so, to be way more specific than that, what we wanted to talk about today is just how the things we do, the choices we make, the behaviors that we choose, the coping that we employ on a day-to-day basis, how that can really be thrown off during times of hardship, and how it can be helpful for us to be thoughtful about many of these things, because they do change and they do feel different. And so ultimately we often find that some of the things that we used to do that worked for us no longer work in the same way, and we might find that many of the things that we avoid are actually things that we need to push ourselves a little bit to do more of. And we might find that many of the things that brought us pleasure now bring us pain, and vice versa. And so we wanted to talk a little bit just about like how are things working out for you, or how do the things you do on a daily basis make you feel, and the different things we might need to consider when looking at a question like, well, how's that working out for you?
Yeah, and I think that one of the things that is interesting is that even in the best of times, I don't think that this is a question we necessarily reflect on that often. In fact, almost especially in the best of times, like things are working for us, we're making decisions that are working for us, and things are kind of falling into place nicely. So it's easy to not really spend a lot of time reflecting on how and why it's working, which then means when life gets disrupted in some dramatic way, whether that be because of a loss of a loved one or because of something like what's going on, a pandemic, what's going on in the world right now, you know, we don't even necessarily have a framework for how do I look at this and assess it. All of a sudden now we're being faced with new decisions about how we're existing in the world and what we're doing and how we're behaving and how it's working for us. But we may not have a good sense of how do I, if I'm starting to realize it's not working as well for me, how do I reflect on that, adapt, adjust, really look at what's working and what's not.
Yeah, certainly. And I think after someone dies, I think the main issue after someone dies is that everything is so raw and there's so many sharp edges in the world that things just feel differently. I think right now, because I think many people are grieving right now in the very acute phases. But for someone like myself, I'm a decade out from my loss. I would say the main loss that I've experienced. I've experienced other losses, but the one that feels most significant to me. So now I think one of the challenges just with the situation right now with COVID and having everything kind of thrown off is that we have to make so many decisions throughout our day that we didn't have to make before. Decisions were kind of made for us in a way. And this isn't true for everybody. Many people are still working their regular jobs. But for me, I feel like I have to make so many decisions about what I do on a day-to-day basis in terms of just down to like when I get up now is a decision I didn't have to make before because I had to get up for school and to get the kids off to school and work and things like that. And, when do I eat breakfast and do I exercise and what do I do because I can't go to the gym? And so there are so many decisions that need to be made right now. And so I think that those are the two main challenges, and they're highlighted with these two situations in different ways. One is needing to make these decisions and trying to make the decisions that are best for us, and the other one with grief is having to decide about the things we do and how they feel for us because they feel so differently. Does that make sense?
Oh, I mean, it makes sense to me. Who knows if it makes sense to our listeners? Well. Hopefully it will, though, as we talk through this a little bit more. It does make sense because I think that one of the things that is really challenging about when things dramatically change in the world around us and we're going through deep emotional pain or the stress of anxiety and uncertainty and all of that, is we're looking for ways to feel better, or we're looking for ways to, or we want, at least theoretically, maybe I should rephrase that. We want theoretically to feel better. We don't want to feel this like extreme either pain or anxiety or discomfort or whatever that we're in. But at the same time, sometimes in those moments, the things that would allow us to feel a little bit better or do things a little bit differently, they may or may not be the things we're actually doing. They may or may not feel appealing. They may not feel obvious to us. So I think there's a lot of ways that it becomes really complicated in those moments.
Yeah. So I think maybe let's talk a little bit more specifically about like how can we assess the different behaviors and coping that we choose on a daily basis? And I think you kind of just, what you said made me think about how we are trying to choose things that make us feel better, right? That is the goal.
Yes.
Either make us feel better because we're not feeling good, or things that just make us feel good, right? That just connect us with things that give us a sense of maybe purpose or connection or positivity or joy. Ultimately, I think most of us would like to be accessing the more feel good side of the spectrum of emotion and experiences if we can, although we should always be open to the full spectrum, right? And I think that one of the things we really need to look at is how are we trying to feel better? Because there's two different, well, it's more complicated, but let's distill it down into saying there are two different ways. There's the way that actually does connect us with things that make us feel a sense of maybe relief, comfort, connection, things that connect us with those more feel good, well-being type of experiences. And then there's the coping that we think makes us feel better because it allows us to avoid pain. And
Yes.
that side of things can be adaptive at times, right? But we really want to caution people to stay away from coping that is only used to avoid. So if we're only using coping to avoid feeling sad, to avoid having a negative interaction, to avoid feeling rejected, if our coping is all in the service of avoiding pain, quite often it doesn't get us to the place of connecting with well-being, right? Sometimes it does, but many times it just becomes a cycle where we're constantly doing that avoiding dance and we never get to a place of feeling an actual sense of feeling better.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that is, one of the things that I was talking about recently. And I use that analogy that we sometimes use about how when we go through something, grief specifically, when we grieve a significant loss, that idea that it doesn't, that the pain doesn't magically go away and the grief doesn't magically go away. It's that we get stronger and we learn how to carry it differently. And we learn how, we learn these ways to be able to cope and manage. And that's sort of us growing stronger. And I think one of the things that's interesting is avoidance. It's sort of the definition of not putting us in a position where we're learning to get stronger, right? It's doing, rather than learning, rather than sort of recognizing that there are things that we can do that help to build us up and that help us to be able to manage things differently or cope or have that sense of well-being. Those are the things that we can practice that over the long term allow us to start carrying some of that pain and grief in new and different ways. And avoidance, we just kind of shut things out completely. So we very rarely, when we're operating in that form of avoidance, very rarely are we doing things that are helping us to kind of get stronger over time. We're just putting like a Band-Aid over feelings in the short term.
Yeah, and avoidance is it's a trap that we all fall into. This is
Oh
not a
God, yeah. Oh
failing
my
in
God,
any
not
way
at all.
because
No.
logically avoidance seems to make the most sense. It's the quickest route to me not feeling this terrible feeling that I'm feeling. And it seems illogical that actually pushing ourselves to feel something painful would actually make us feel more connected with our loved one or feel more comfort, though that is what we know to be more true. I think about it a lot with like thinking about exercise, which I'm not the best at doing, but I do know it's you push yourself to do something that you may feel is very unpleasant, but afterwards you get all the rewards of it. You get the endorphins, you get the sense of accomplishment, you get the good health. And so there are so many rewards that come with pushing yourself. And so coping with hardship and stress and grief often looks a lot like that. We have to push ourselves to experience the pain so that we can be more connected with our loved one. And so I think it might be helpful, Lisa, if we give some examples of what avoidance practically is, so that it might illustrate a little bit of how it does cut us off from some of those benefits of maybe choosing the hard road.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, well, wow, this was not, something that's interesting. I'm not even necessarily going to say this is like a full example of what we were thinking of today, but it just came so present to mind with what you just described that it feels worth mentioning, which is that when the other day I was going through, I had got some boxes that I had been avoiding going through, just not because of anything emotional or grief related, but because I just hadn't had the time and energy. And so I started going through them and I found this box that I had on it labeled the box. I wish I could remember exactly what I had written, but it said something like sad stuff. And I remembered labeling the box. This was a box of things I moved from my mom's house. And I remember when I was at my mom's house, packing it up to sell, that I had actually started going through this box and I had gotten so emotional and sad and upset that I had just shut the box and taped it and written sad stuff on it and was like, I'll deal with that later. I can't deal with it. And I just literally like put it to the side completely. And in that moment, that was necessary and adaptive. Like I had a very real task at hand that I had to do at my mother's house. And I couldn't open the door to that. But it was interesting because when I got this box out and saw it and I remembered that, I had this moment where I was like, oh, do I have this? I don't even want to open this box. I was like, I don't know if I have it in me right now. As you know, as I've said on this podcast recently, I've had a lot of new recent losses that have come up. The pandemic has been a tough emotional time. And I really sat there and like, very rarely do I think my brain makes a conscious decision where I'm like, do I want to avoid or not avoid? But it was a very real moment of me sort of thinking, do I want to avoid or not avoid? And I decided to open the box and start to go through it while giving myself permission to say, like, if this is too much, I am going to set this aside and I'll come back to it later. And it actually, interestingly, ended up being really nice and lovely. And it was a moment where the stuff that was in it, which had made me really, really sad in that moment a few years ago at my mom's house, it was still sad, but it wasn't overwhelming in the same way it had been then. And so it was just, I don't know, as you were talking, I was thinking to myself, oh my gosh, I just had like a very concrete moment of this coming up. It would have been really easy for me to just be like, nope, not even going to open it, setting it aside. And had I done that, it wouldn't, there were like some really great like photos and a couple of things that had been from my grandmother's house that were actually like really nice and comforting for me to find. So I was glad that I didn't go the avoidance route.
Yeah, I would say that's a textbook perfect example. First and foremost of how sometimes using avoidance can be adaptive, right? You had a task at hand. You knew you couldn't spend the however many hours it would take you to go through something in a thoughtful way and to experience all those emotions. And so you set it aside. And so we always are the first to say that's totally okay, as long as you do set it aside with the intent to revisit it when you're ready. And so I think that it's a perfect example of how we can dance around this the box of sad things, right? We don't want to open that box. And so we might avoid, avoid, avoid. Well, had you kept avoiding that, you never would have had that connection with the past and with the reminders and the memories. And so you had to push yourself past that sadness, not past it, or I would say into it, in order to experience that connection. And so I feel like that's really a perfect example of how we sometimes need to just push ourselves away from the easiest thing or the quickest or the safest, right? Some other
Yeah.
examples people might experience. And I want to note that spotting avoidance can be a lot harder than you might think. Like, there are the obvious examples of avoiding pain. The first one that often comes to mind is, oh, people use substances to numb their pain. And yes, of course, that is a perfect example. We might use substances, drinking and other substances, in order to avoid feeling our emotions and our feelings when things get hard. And so that's a really obvious one. But there are other ones I think that are less obvious. Like, it might be that we spend all our time throwing our energy into other things, like maybe going back to work or taking care of other people, so that we don't have to face our own grief, or so that we don't have to maybe be at home and be surrounded by grief reminders. And so there are things that look like very normal day-to-day things that we can often push ourselves into in order to avoid other experiences. And then in grief, we of course know, like your example was avoiding reminders, right? Objects. It might be avoiding places that we know remind us of our loved one, avoiding people. And so there are all sorts of ways that we avoid feeling and thinking things that we deem distressing or unpleasant. Are there any other examples that jump to mind?
No, I mean, I think that those are the big ones that we often see. I think sometimes they can also be, and this came up recently, and it's related to these, but I think sometimes the reminders are also our own thoughts and memories. I had a friend sort of talk about this recently. It's like sometimes it's the outside world. So it's a specific object or a place or a person. And sometimes it's literally just spending time with memories that are difficult. And I had a friend who was just talking about the idea that she was finally at this point where she realized there were a bunch of memories of her dad that she had just been like sort of actively not thinking about, because when she would think of them, they made her sad.
Mhm.
And she was like, it wasn't that I was consciously avoiding them, but I just sort of realized that. And so it was interesting because it had me thinking about the idea that we doesn't even necessarily have to be an external stimulus.
Oh yeah. I
avoiding.
was just thinking about this as well the other day. I was actually started taking notes on writing a post about it. It's the idea that we can avoid our pain, and specifically when this was first talked about, it was the idea of like anxiety and internal conflict, but it's the idea of intellectualization. So when we are faced with a really like scary and emotional situation, we'll bypass our emotion by like thinking about it, and to intellectualize it, or to maybe be theoretical about it, and to think in very to take it away from any feeling, any emotion, but to look at it very like from this, like, I'm going to look at this objectively or learn everything I can about it, and I'm going to then like analyze my experiences. And by doing so, you totally cut yourself off from the emotions that you fear experiencing. I think it's a really fascinating, probably because, Lisa, I think it's something that we do from time to time on What's Your Grief.
Definitely. We definitely do it.
What's Your Grief may actually be a manifestation of our own intellectualization. But it's one of those things that, again, is like totally normal. We know there are many ways of coping with grief that do involve more thinking about things and being more rational. So it's one of those things that we want to find balance with, but it's definitely a way that we can avoid our emotions if we say we're going to spend all our time up here in our head, like thinking this through and never connecting with our emotions involved in that. And so I think that like that example and the examples you shared, Lisa, and then just even the example of like something that I mentioned was like the most obvious that people often cite, and that's using alcohol or other substances. I think the question that we often have to ask ourselves is like, why are we doing it, and like how's it working out for us when we do it, because it is so hard to know sometimes whether we're like balancing well or whether we have ventured into that avoidance negative coping territory.
Yeah, I agree. I think it is a really, really tough to look at where am I in a place where, this is just a little bit of escape and that it's okay. And then where it's actually edged into something that looks like a problem. And I think the first place is just really asking yourself, have you thought about it at all? Like, have you asked yourself the question or done any self-assessment, especially when we're looking at something like substances, about, how much am I consuming? How much is sort of considered non-problem or moderate use? Have I assessed that? Have I set for myself any kind of goals, or if goals might be the wrong word, but any sort of kind of limits for myself, whether that's saying, okay, I never have more than, two drinks in an evening, or I only limit having a drink on the weekends and not on the weeknights. Have I set those? And if I have, am I able to stick to them? And for a lot of people, when we ask these questions to ourselves, this is not about like, oh, you should have thought about all this stuff. Because for most people haven't. Most people don't even know what Health and Human Services recommend as a moderate amount of consumption for men and women. This isn't something, most people don't even know what a serving size of alcohol looks like. So the first step is often just, have you really looked at that or thought about it and assessed for yourself what you feel comfortable with?
Yeah, I think really good advice. I think that we often believe that we'll know when something has become a problem for us. Like, we say to ourselves, oh, I would know if I had a drinking problem, or I would know if I'm isolating. And it actually isn't that obvious in the moment many times. I think quite often, one, it happens so incrementally for many people that we don't see it happening. And two, I think that our brains are really good at rationalizing things and saying, oh, it's not a problem for X, Y, and Z reasons, and ignoring evidence to the contrary. And so I think that we often believe that we'll know. And it isn't until we're outside of ourselves, not outside of ourselves, but outside of the situation, looking back, that we're like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I didn't see it. Like, I missed all the signs, and I feel so much different now that I'm not in the middle of that situation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that tendency to think that, we have this very, again, like when we put things into kind of neat little categories, we think to ourselves, oh, either someone has a substance use disorder or they don't. And I think not being able to have that flexibility to say, at a given moment, something might be working for me just fine. And in another moment, it might not be that extreme of a problem, but it's certainly a problem. It's certainly not working well for me. And so I think it is just a challenging space for us, because we sometimes don't look at that incremental, sort of those little incremental problems that seem small individually, but then they start to add up. And that's when we end up with people going, wow, I didn't realize it was a problem until it was a problem. Right. And I think that's what we kind of want to help everyone to avoid, is how do I be a little bit more reflective earlier on and realize, okay, I can catch that. And if I start to realize that I was setting some, like for me, I think a good mark is if I set a limit for myself of some sort and I realize that I am not able to consistently maintain that limit, for me, that's always a moment where I'm like, ooh, what's going on here, that I said I was going to have, no more than 2 glasses of wine tonight, and then I had more. Or what's going on that I said, I set that limit to myself of, a certain number of days or whatever it might be. If I'm not able to stick to that for whatever reason, that's always going to be a moment that I step back and I start asking myself a few questions about what's going on.
Right. I think another thing that we don't often deliberately do, like we think we'll know, but we don't don't until we stop and think about it, is just like stopping to ask ourselves, like, how does this make me feel when I'm doing this, or when I choose this behavior, how do I ultimately feel in the end? I think we'll realize when something's making us miserable, but often I don't think we realize it, unless it's really kind of extreme. There are so many things that we do that maybe feel hard at first, and then they get us to a place of feeling that positive emotion or something better. But there are many things that we just do, as we said, with the avoidance cycle, that never get us to a place of feeling better. So, we might have began drinking those 2 glasses of wine because we like the feeling of just being able to relax. Maybe we like the social aspect of it, but we've gotten to a place where now we're drinking to a place where we then fall asleep, and then in the morning we feel terrible, and at no point do we ever feel good about this. And other things might be that we opt out of going and doing anything. I think, especially when we are stuck at home, we get into the habit of being at home. And so we may continuously make choices that are more and more making our world smaller and smaller. And so we might say it's too much effort. I don't want to maybe go out for a walk or get on a Zoom or whatever it is that we can do right now. And ultimately, in the end, we just feel like still very isolated and alone, and we never get ourselves to a place of feeling anything positive. And so I think asking people when they're looking at behaviors to step back and say, like, how does this make me feel in the moment and afterwards? And is it ever connecting me with any sense of accomplishment, achievement, purpose, meaning, joy, happiness, relief, comfort, connection, anything?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that it can be really complicated because in those moments where if all we're looking for is sort of an ease from distress, it distorts things because sometimes that ease from distress is there in the short term.
Right.
And that confuses things for us. And, even on in like these really interesting, I think certainly at least with alcohol, especially in these really neurochemical ways, the irony of the way alcohol works on our brain, in the fact that in the short term when it's in your system, it's reducing anxiety. It's, doing all of the things to our brain that lowers it, which is really, really appealing. But then what that means over the long term is it actually wears down that neurotransmitter system so that your baseline anxiety goes way up. So
Right.
it's just like so ironic that this thing that in the short term you're like, oh no, it does feel really good because for those few hours my anxiety was way down. What that actually means over the long term is that your anxiety at baseline is going up. So it becomes
Mhm.
really like we can distort to ourselves
Yeah,
whether
absolutely.
it's serving us in the long term because we feel like, oh, well, it gave me that nice break for like 3 hours, but then we underestimate what the
Yeah.
repercussions of that break were.
Well, yeah, and I think that I think you're right. I think with so many of these things, it's so hard for us to objectively look at them, especially when we have the chemical benefit of many things that we do.
Yeah.
And so I think that you're right. And there are so many at the time. We might have the impact of the avoidance and the relief from the distress and the substance or whatever it is we're doing, and then afterwards we may have the rationalization that we're engaging in. And so sometimes I think that is why people feel like they have to hit an extreme in order to actually make any changes. Or I think it is when somebody finally maybe has someone confront them honestly about how their behavior is impacting them or other people, or
Yeah.
maybe getting into counseling that really allows people to have this moment. And I think that's why we want to talk about this and just encourage people to like be thoughtful and proactive in like small ways, especially
Yeah.
now, because Lisa, you mentioned this earlier. When we are in a time like now, a time of hardship and a time of just everything being different, and when we're in a time like grief, we often give ourselves permission to just like do whatever, and say, I'll do something different later. And sometimes that later never really comes.
Yeah. And I think that right now, I've been thinking about it a lot because there are also, I think, examples of this where sometimes we also are getting like positive reinforcement or giving ourselves positive reinforcement. And I think an example that came up for me is I have had a few really significant losses recently, and I've been feeling kind of acute grief things in a way that I haven't in a long time. And then with the pandemic going on, I've been socially distancing, socially isolating at home. I live alone. And so one of the things that I realized a few weeks ago I was doing is that I was just working all the time. And I was just, I was realizing that one of the things I was doing was I was getting, from the minute I was getting up till the minute I was going to bed, I was just kind of working all the time. And that might not mean every single hour, obviously, of that time. I would take breaks to do different things, but I would just keep coming back to doing work. And in a lot of ways, that was, I think, because that was sort of avoidance of both the kind of grief feelings that were coming up, maybe some of the loneliness and isolation. It was a distraction from those things. And ultimately, in a lot of ways, when we get into that overworking, I think we can get positive reinforcement from people. Like if people go back to work and they throw all their time and effort into working overtime, people are like, oh, you're doing so great. You're back to work. You're doing wonderful. And sometimes we don't see that might just be avoiding some of the difficult stuff that's going on. And so I think for me, I did have to take this moment of like, oh wait, I need to pull back on this, because this, even though outwardly it might feel like it's really serving me, it in the long term, I think definitely was not. It was just like a moment of avoidance that was really kind of creeping up for me early on.
Yeah, you're right. I think that there are a lot of instances where things get really positively reinforced by our own selves or by people outside of us that could be avoidance. I think working is a great example. I think taking care of other people is a good example as well. We don't discourage anybody from taking care of their family and friends and loved ones. But we have seen time and time again parents who said, oh, I threw everything into taking care of my kids. And I realized later that I was not focusing at all on myself. And I think to some extent that was intentional. And it might not be your kids. It might just be your friends, right? You might be like, I'm the one who takes care of everybody. I don't take care of myself. I take care of everyone else. And I think that's a role that many people step into. But the danger is that you might actually never get around to taking care of yourself. And then, of course, we hear all the time people applauding other people for being strong. And of course, it's wonderful to have strength, but I think strength and grief looks very different than what people often applaud and positively reinforce. I think strength and grief is actually allowing yourself to feel the emotion and to be emotional and to be vulnerable. And what people are often labeling as strength is just stuffing things and staying very stoic. And it may be that person is doing grief perfectly healthy for them and it works totally for them. But also I think sometimes it can be that people are not feeling their feelings. And so it's something that I think people can get really mixed messages about. So, absolutely. Yeah. Was there anything else we should add about this, Lisa? I think we've talked a bit about it, and actually, there's a couple of articles on our site that we have about this. If people have questions, they can email us, and we can point you in that direction. And I actually have a few ideas for new articles after this discussion, I think.
Oh, well, then perfect. That's always good when it prompts ideas for new articles too. So
yes.
No, well, I think that this covers a lot of the sort of basics of this. And I'm sure hopefully even if the examples we've given aren't the ones that are maybe specific to you, hopefully it may at least translate to or thinking about other areas of your life and just thinking, because that's the thing that's tricky with avoidance. Like there's no checklist to say, oh, here's the way that you're, of doing, like engaging in these little behaviors that might be masking avoidance or might be avoidance. Part of it is just spending a little time self-reflecting about it. So even if these weren't the perfect examples, hopefully it gave you some food for thought.
Right. And I think that this can happen in big and small ways. I think with grief, it becomes so obvious to many of us, the things that we want to avoid. But I think when when we're not talking about grief. There are just things that we do in our day-to-day lives, like even procrastination is a way of avoiding, and that's something that hangs over our head. We go around and around in circles until we finally maybe just get the thing done, and then we feel much better, right? And so I think that there are like small ways that we do this outside of grief examples that are really kind of subtle. And so we just want to get people thinking about it and looking at the things that they're doing on a daily basis. And that said, I think a good place to leave people would be to give yourself also some self-kindness and self-compassion and a break. Right now, I think we're all making all sorts of choices, and some of them feel like they were the right ones for us in that moment, and some of them don't. And many of us, I think, wake up with this idea that they're going to have a very productive and structured day, and it doesn't work out that way. And so at the same time as wanting people to be thoughtful about this, we also want people to be very kind to themselves and acknowledge that, when things are stressful and things are hard, it's a trial and error thing, and we get through the day how we get through the day.
Yeah, absolutely.
So with that, again, we will leave you with our email address, podcast@whatsyourgrief.com. Please email us with any topic suggestions or questions that you may have. Please also, if you're listening to this any place where you can leave a review or a rating, we encourage you to do that because it will help other people to find the podcast in the future.